Hi everyone, and welcome back to Stellar HFY. First, thank you. The support you've shown lately has been incredible. Every comment, every theory, and every breakdown you post pushes these stories further. Today we're stepping into Mars orbit, where the Threxian Accord arrived certain they'd humiliate Earth. Their Dreadnought was unstoppable. Their shields were flawless. Until one moment changed everything. Let's find out why. The Gale Sovereign crossed Mars orbit like a predator entering a preserve, its drive wake scattering telemetry across every available channel. It moved under the official cover of a treaty inspection, an open broadcast demonstration of Accord compliance rights. That alone would have drawn attention, but the ship's size and configuration made it impossible to ignore. At over a kilometer in length, plated with the layered shielding of a fleet command vessel, it was a message written in mass and velocity. Earth would watch this carefully orchestrated humiliation unfold in its own backyard. Neutral observation craft hung in fixed positions along the exercise perimeter, their job to record every maneuver for the Interstellar Compliance Assembly. The rules of these demonstrations were clear. The host system could not interfere, only observe. The visiting force could test weapons against designated targets. Both sides knew the subtext. These events existed as much for propaganda as for treaty maintenance. The Gale Sovereign was not simply here to test Earth's defenses, it was here to remind Earth what the Accord thought of them. Commander Rourke Venn stood in the main coordination deck of Earth Defense Command's Orbital Operations Center. Eyes on the live tracking feed as the Dreadnought adjusted its station-keeping burn. To the Threxians, this was routine positioning. To Rourke, it was more than that. The Gale Sovereign was a massive sensor array in motion, sweeping Earth's orbits, cataloging launch trajectories, reaction times, and orbital defense configurations, all under the guise of a sanctioned demonstration. The exercise wasn't just about showing how weak Earth's weapons were. It was about quietly mapping Sol's defensive spine. The political response had been immediate and predictable. Earth's ambassador issued sharp objections in the assembly, arguing that holding the demonstration within Mars orbit was unnecessary. The Accord dismissed the protests as theatrics. The exercise had been scheduled, observers were in place, and the Dreadnought would proceed. The media picked up the story, framing it as another example of Earth's status as a second-tier Accord member, a species tolerated but never respected. That was fine by Rourke. Public frustration created noise, and noise gave him room to maneuver. On the operations deck, his orders were precise and unremarkable. Traffic Control Directive 14 was issued across Earth's orbital sectors. It was a standing order that required adjustment of non-critical station orbits and debris clearance whenever an authorized demonstration took place. To the Assembly's observers, it was routine housekeeping, ensuring no civilian platforms drifted into the exercise zone. But Directive 14 had a second function. It allowed orbital control to redistribute maintenance assets without external approval. Drones flagged as debris collectors began slow, unobtrusive burns to shift into their assigned paths. None of them looked like anything more than old hardware tasked with cleaning up navigation hazards. Rourke knew every one of those drones by serial number. Most of them were stripped-down hulls built decades ago for orbital construction projects. They were useless in combat, but each carried the capacity to project controlled electromagnetic reflections, calibrated to mimic common signal anomalies in low orbit. It was an old trick, so unremarkable that Accord sensor crews usually ignored them. If they noticed anything at all, they logged it as a navigational quirk and moved on. Rourke counted on that. From his vantage, Rourke didn't need to watch the Gale Sovereign's massive silhouette dominating the live feed. He watched the Accord's smaller craft, the sensor tenders and escort ships positioned along the Dreadnought's perimeter. Their passive scanning was constant, their communications traffic brisk. This wasn't just a display for the assembly. The Threxians were watching for patterns, looking for inefficiencies in Earth's defense response. The exercise gave them justification to do it in the open. He gave no sign of the operation taking shape in his command orders. The orbital deck functioned under standard protocols. Communications kept deliberately routine. The harbor's wake, a registered asteroid tug running a maintenance vector, received a quiet adjustment to its course. It was officially tasked with redirecting a hazardous debris fragment drifting toward Mars's high orbit. The file marked it as a slow-moving maintenance job, well within treaty parameters. The tug's crew logged the course change without question, just another debris redirect, the kind they handled every week. Every move was deliberate, every change buried in the kind of procedural bureaucracy that never drew the eye. The Threxians weren't looking for these kinds of movements. They were watching the destroyers. They were watching the primary launch bays. They were looking for missiles, railguns, and anything that could make for an impressive show on their terms. That was exactly where Rourke wanted their attention fixed. In the assembly, the talking points continued. The Accord's representatives emphasized cooperation, mutual transparency, and harmonizing defensive doctrines. It was the kind of language designed to sound benign. The Interstellar Compliance Assembly repeated it faithfully to the public channels. Few of them cared that Earth's destroyers would be required to fire live weapons into a simulation field that the Accord controlled. Few noticed that the Gale Sovereign's position allowed it to log the exact dispersal, range, and reloading intervals of every human weapon in service. Rourke cared. Every detail of this exercise was calibrated to advantage the Accord. Earth would comply. Earth would look weak. The perception would solidify across the Accord's member states, and the Gale Sovereign's tactical crews would leave with a complete set of data on human weaponry, unless they left with something else. That was the core of Rourke's calculation. The exercise had rules. The rules could not be broken, not openly, but within those rules there were patterns. The Gale Sovereign's configuration gave it tremendous forward firepower, but its shield harmonics shifted depending on the scenario. Those shifts had vulnerabilities. They were rare, they were temporary, and they required conditions that didn't occur in routine patrols. But they could occur in a demonstration. Rourke wasn't planning on an open fight. That would be a violation of every treaty clause the exercise was built on. What he needed was something else, a way to use the demonstration itself as cover, a way to make every observer in the assembly see exactly what happened, and yet leave them with nothing they could formally charge. He didn't need a victory. He needed the right kind of result, recorded by the right observers. That would make any future demonstration too dangerous to repeat. The operations deck cycled into final readiness as the Gale Sovereign completed its positioning burn. The neutral observation craft pinged in confirmation that all conditions were met. Public channels broadcast the exercise start, the assembly's commentary echoing through every major Accord media outlet. To the galaxy, this was another small spectacle, a reminder that Earth was still playing with outdated tools. To Rourke, it was the opening of a timed window. Every asset was in place. Every adjustment was within the rules. The Gale Sovereign was about to begin its demonstration. Rourke's operation was already underway. The exercise they had planned to humiliate Earth had just become the stage for something else entirely. The first salvo from Earth's destroyers lit against the void, leaving streaks of exhaust that dissipated long before the projectiles crossed the designated firing corridor. The inertially guided rounds were simple, chemical propellant slugs, their guidance systems designed for predictable trajectories that could be tracked by any Accord-grade sensor. On the assembly's broadcast, neutral observers noted the impacts on the mock targets: clean, precise, and entirely unimpressive. The targets shattered as expected, nothing more. The visual was intentional. It was a performance of adequacy, not dominance. Aboard the Gale Sovereign, the Threxian tactical crew made no effort to conceal their reaction. Open channel commentary filtered through the demonstration broadcast, translated into the assembly's common tongue. Observers heard clipped technical assessments delivered with an undertone that didn't need explaining. Phrases like kinetic saturation at obsolete levels and impact dispersion confirms pre-Accord design were followed by measured silences that carried the same weight as laughter. In the assembly's neutral feed, those phrases were documented as routine performance assessments. In the Accord's military channels, they were entertainment. Commander Rourke Venn had anticipated every note of this reaction. The Gale Sovereign's commentary was not simply arrogance, it was part of the demonstration. By mocking Earth's capabilities, the Threxians reinforced the narrative that these exercises were routine, even pointless. It kept attention exactly where Rourke wanted it, on the obvious, on the surface-level spectacle. He had no intention of breaking that pattern. Every underwhelming projectile fired, Every precisely limited impact built the appearance of exactly what the Threxians wanted to see. Beyond the spectacle, the real work continued in silence. Earth's orbital debris removal units, cleared by Traffic Control Directive 14, moved along their updated paths. To any observer, they were no more interesting than the shifting orbits of derelict station modules. Their burns were small, their velocity changes minimal, and none of them intersected the Gale Sovereign's demonstration zone. That was the point. They weren't weapons. They were officially registered maintenance drones, their work verified by multiple levels of Accord protocol. They moved like background elements, fading into the cluttered layers of Mars orbit. One of those drones adjusted its position in perfect alignment with a static debris field just beyond the observation perimeter. The movement was deliberate but unremarkable, so slow it barely registered against the drift of nearby objects. Another unit slipped behind a decommissioned mining platform, its signal profile blending into the platform's outdated transponders. Together, their subtle adjustments began to form a pattern that to the untrained eye was nothing more than orbital housekeeping. To Rourke, it was the quiet shaping of an environment. Meanwhile, the harbor's wake continued its assigned course. The tug was a blocky, underpowered vessel, one of dozens in Earth's registry, with a legitimate contract to redirect a hazardous debris cluster drifting toward Mars's shadow. The contract was filed weeks earlier, buried in maintenance schedules reviewed by the Assembly. No one questioned it. The crew on board followed the procedure exactly. Verify trajectory, plot course, engage engines, and file their progress with orbital control. It was the kind of work no one noticed, except Rourke, who had specifically assigned the tug for this path. From the Gale Sovereign, the human vessels looked exactly as expected, underpowered, outdated, and entirely predictable. Every move reinforced the narrative. The destroyers fired on schedule, each launch carefully timed to produce results that looked clean but underwhelming. There were no surprises, no deviations, no indication that anything unexpected might occur. The Threxian analysts saw exactly what they expected to see. They marked down every range and reload time, building their data profile with the easy confidence of observers who believe they are in complete control of the scenario. The open mockery continued in the public commentary. Tactical reload intervals align with century-old designs. Impact velocity insufficient against hardened Accord hulls. No evidence of adaptive targeting. These weren't simply assessments. They were signals to every listening system that the Accord had nothing to fear from Sol. Every derisive note was a carefully planted seed, and every one of them made the Gale Sovereign less likely to suspect anything out of pattern. Rourke let it happen. Every dismissive remark was another layer of cover. Every routine sensor sweep that failed to pick up the quiet repositioning of debris units was another confirmation that the pattern held. The Accord wanted a demonstration that proved human weakness. Rourke would give them a demonstration, but not the one they expected. The neutral observers remained fixed in their positions, recording everything for the Assembly's verification. To them, nothing unusual was occurring. The demonstration was proceeding exactly as outlined in the pre-mission agreements. Earth's destroyers cycled through their firing orders. The Gale Sovereign maintained its dominant orbit, its escorts shifting position with precise formation discipline. The stage was set exactly as the Threxians wanted it, stable, predictable, and entirely under their control. Far from the visible lines of engagement, the harbor's wake made a minor adjustment to its vector. The change was logged automatically in the Accord's navigational registry, a fractional burn to ensure its debris load would not drift into the outer approach lanes. It was a maneuver so routine that it passed without comment, but that small adjustment placed it in a position where Mars's shadow would eventually block it from direct observation. In the operations center, Rourke watched the exercise unfold. Every component was moving into place. The Gale Sovereign's attention was fixed on the obvious. The maintenance drones were invisible in their routine patterns. The tug's course was unremarkable, and all of it was documented in a way that left no space for official protest. The demonstration continued, the mockery echoed across public channels, and Mars's shadow grew closer to the tug's path. To the galaxy, it was a standard exercise. To the Threxians, it was another display of human inadequacy. To Rourke, it was the slow construction of an environment that would make them Gale Sovereign's confidence its most dangerous vulnerability. Midway through the scheduled demonstration, the Gale Sovereign initiated the second phase of its exercise. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, not because anyone on Earth expected a surprise, but because it marked the shift from passive target evaluation to live assault simulation. The Dreadnought's tactical systems locked onto a designated orbital platform in Mars's upper orbit. The platform was an old survey station refitted as a compliant target for the demonstration, its structural framework carefully reinforced to absorb non-destructive fire. On the assembly's public feed, commentators spoke of cooperation and transparency. In the control room at Earth Defense Command, Rourke watched the targeting telemetry come alive, knowing this was the opening he had planned for. As the Gale Sovereign prepared to fire, its shield configuration began to shift. This was no casual adjustment. This was doctrine. In order to stabilize the massive forward beam arrays for sustained firing, the Dreadnought's shielding was reconfigured into a locked forward stance. All available power was concentrated into frontal protection, ensuring the ship could maintain maximum offensive output without compromising energy stability. It was a standard maneuver, one repeated countless times in training exercises and fleet demonstrations across Accord space. And in every one of those scenarios, it created the same geometry, a fixed offensive posture with reduced lateral flexibility. That fixed posture was exactly what Rourke had been waiting for. It wasn't a flaw in the Threxian design, not in the conventional sense. It was simply a trade-off, unavoidable in any system that prioritized heavy beam output. But it was a trade-off that created a momentary gap in shield harmonics along specific vectors. Those vectors were rarely relevant in open combat, where no opponent could reliably exploit them under normal conditions. In a demonstration, however, with the Gale Sovereign anchored in place and focused entirely on a simulated target, the condition could be predicted. In the operations deck, Rourke's team marked the change. Shield harmonic readings confirmed the forward lock, the precise output stabilizing along the predicted frequency. Mars's shadow now fully covered the harbor's wake as it completed its scheduled debris redirection. The tug's positioning was exactly as planned, just outside the direct observation arcs, its movement indistinguishable from routine navigation corrections. The neutral observation craft remained focused on the primary engagement zone, their sensors tracking the Gale Sovereign's weapons as the massive arrays cycled up to firing readiness. The timing window was narrow. It always would be. The Threxian shield configuration in offensive mode was designed for short-term engagements. The forward lock would hold only as long as the primary beam array was engaged. When the sequence ended, the shields would revert to their balanced configuration. Rourke needed the setup to be complete before that reset occurred. Every element depended on precision, not speed, but synchronization. The harbor's wake received its quiet trigger. The crew, unaware of the full scope of the operation, executed a planned detonation of its debris load. The charge was small, nothing more than a controlled burst designed to scatter the debris into a pre-mapped dispersal corridor. To anyone watching, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a low-grade blast to break apart a cluster of hazardous material. The dispersal vector had been logged days earlier in orbital hazard reports, reviewed and approved by the Accord's Navigation Authority. What the Accord's logs didn't reflect was the engineered nature of the debris. Inside the harmless rock and metal fragments was a compact canister filled with microparticles of conductive alloy. When the charge fired, the particles dispersed into a thin, expanding cloud. In the vacuum of space, they spread quickly along their plotted trajectory. To Threxian sensors, the effect was unremarkable. Background interference, the kind of static often generated by solar activity. In fact, the burst mimicked the signature profile of a minor solar event. The Gale Sovereign's sensor systems registered the anomaly. Its automated filters processed the spike, categorized it as environmental noise, and applied standard compensations. This was normal. The Dreadnought systems were designed to ignore minor anomalies to avoid sensor overload during operations. To the Accord's observers, there was nothing unusual. Solar interference was a known complication of inter-system operations. The demonstration proceeded without interruption. Inside Earth Defense Command's operations deck, Rourke watched the interference cloud unfold on his tracking displays. The particles formed a wide but precisely calculated corridor, their conductivity creating subtle distortions in sensor returns. The Gale Sovereign's forward-locked shields could not account for an approach through that corridor, not because they were incapable of adapting, but because their sensor prioritization at that moment simply wasn't tracking it. The Dreadnought's focus was entirely on the orbital platform it had targeted, its firing solution locked in place. Rourke knew the Threxians would not question this. Their doctrine was built on the assumption that their technology could not be outmaneuvered by anything Earth had in service. Minor anomalies were routine, procedural noise was ignored, and no one on the Gale Sovereign believed the demonstration presented any risk. That was the advantage Rourke had counted on from the beginning, not in weapons but in expectation. In the assembly's feed, the countdown to the Gale Sovereign's beam discharge filled the broadcast commentary. Observers detailed the precision of the ship's targeting systems, the stability of its firing platform, the exact calibration of its output. The commentary was focused on the spectacle, the engineering display, the technological superiority being projected for the audience. No one in the assembly was looking for anything else. On the Gale Sovereign, the Threxian crew prepared for the firing sequence with the calm precision of a vessel in total control. They had no reason to hurry, no reason to suspect their posture created any vulnerability. The Dreadnought's escorts maintained position, their attention fixed on maintaining formation integrity. The maintenance drones in orbit continued their movements, blending into the background of orbital traffic. The corridor was open, the shield harmonics were fixed, the interference cloud drifted exactly as calculated. The exercise was still running under full compliance. No alarms had sounded, no warnings had been issued. And in the control room at Earth Defense Command, Rourke watched the narrow moment he had engineered take shape, knowing that everything depended on what came next. From Mars's shadow, the harbor's wake drifted in its registered lane, its path obscured from direct observation by the interference cloud now spreading invisibly through the designated exercise zone. The tug's hull was unremarkable, its silhouette identical to any other asteroid handler in Earth's registry. The vessel's log still read as debris redirection, clear, routine, and entirely within the allowances of the treaty. The Accord's observation craft were focused on the Gale Sovereign's firing sequence, and no sensor flagged the tug as anything but background noise. Within the small cargo bay of the tug, the kinetic lance assembly was locked into its final firing solution. The weapon itself was old, predating half the Accord's modern tactical doctrines, and it looked every bit of it. It wasn't sophisticated, and that was the point. There was nothing for the Threxian sensors to flag. The magnetic acceleration system was low emission, the firing signature indistinguishable from a maintenance impulse burn. To the Gale Sovereign, it was a piece of hardware beneath notice. The targeting solution had been calculated hours in advance, refined as the Dreadnought's position, stabilized in its locked forward assault stance. The auxiliary heat vent, the vulnerability in the Gale Sovereign's offensive posture, was not a flaw in design. It was a trade-off, a necessity when the reactor output was fully channeled toward the beam arrays. For a kinetic strike to reach it, the approach vector had to be exact, and the timing had to fall within the narrow window before shield harmonics reset. The particle cloud had created that corridor. The lance would take it. On the bridge of Earth Defense Command, Rourke Venn gave no dramatic signal, no announcement, no declaration. His operations team executed the final authorization without altering their steady rhythm. There was no need for urgency, only precision. The lance fired. It moved silently through the vacuum, a slender dart of dense alloy accelerating along a plotted trajectory that accounted for every gravitational influence, every predicted drift of the interference particles. It did not flare or announce itself. It did not blaze a trail across the void. It was invisible except to the handful of tracking instruments inside Earth's own tactical network. To the Gale Sovereign, it was not visible at all. The lance struck exactly where it was aimed. At the auxiliary heat vent, the impact was not explosive, but surgical. The dense slug penetrated the venting structure, transferring enough kinetic energy to compromise the shielding around the secondary reactor loop. The reactor's automated safety systems responded instantly, interpreting the impact as a critical containment hazard. The fail-safe protocols shut down the reactor to prevent overload, cascading the shutdown into linked systems. Inside the Gale Sovereign, the effects were immediate. Power to the primary weapon arrays dropped to zero. Propulsion output collapsed. The Dreadnought's massive hull shifted minutely as maneuvering thrusters struggled to compensate. The ship's forward-lock shield geometry flickered, its harmonics destabilized by the sudden loss of power distribution. For the Accord's observers, the visual was dramatic in its simplicity. The Dreadnought's beam arrays went dark mid-cycle, its massive drive plume extinguishing in the span of seconds. The Gale Sovereign drifted, its once perfect station-keeping orbit beginning to decay as the automated systems transitioned into emergency stabilization mode. Across the Accord's fleet, communications spiked. Escort ships tightened formation, maneuvering to compensate for the sudden loss of centralized command output. The fleet's tactical net became a haze of recalibration, formation adjustments, and status requests. The Gale Sovereign remained silent. In the assembly's neutral broadcast, there was no alarm, only the carefully composed voices of observers, noting that the Dreadnought's demonstration had been interrupted by a technical fault. The footage, however, was undeniable. The most advanced warship in the Accord's inventory had gone from full operational control to a powerless drift without firing a shot. On the Earth Defense Command operations deck, there was no visible celebration. Rourke kept his eyes on the display, monitoring the Gale Sovereign's slow drift. His ships did not advance. No human vessel moved to capitalize on the Dreadnought's vulnerability. Every action taken remained within the bounds of the demonstration's established rules. This was not a battle. It was still, officially, a weapons evaluation exercise. Rourke knew that the choice to hold position was as important as the strike itself. Moving to exploit the Gale Sovereign's shutdown would have transformed the incident into an act of aggression. That was not the goal. The operation's strength lay in its compliance. The demonstration was proceeding under the terms the Accord had dictated, and the outcome was now a matter of record for every neutral observer to review. The Dreadnought's escorts shifted to protective formation, their comms encrypted, their movements sharp. The Gale Sovereign itself remained in safe mode. Emergency systems isolating damaged components, the secondary reactor offline. In Mars orbit, the great warship that had come to prove human weapons obsolete now hung silent, dependent on its escorts to maintain control of the situation. The particle cloud continued its harmless dispersal, the harbor's wake maintaining its registered course. On every Accord sensor log, the sequence of events would appear exactly as it was: a minor solar interference event, followed by an unforeseen reactor fault during the Dreadnought's demonstration cycle. Nothing in those logs would link the two. In the Assembly's chambers, representatives began drafting the language of official statements. The incident would need explanation, but no one would risk a claim that implied the Dreadnought had been compromised by hostile action. The recording of the demonstration, verified by neutral observers, would show no violation of treaty terms by Earth. The facts could not be rewritten. Rourke stood at the edge of the operations deck, watching the Gale Sovereign's drifting hull settle into stabilization. The silence that followed was not the quiet of victory. It was the sound of a shift in perception. The Dreadnought had not been destroyed, and Earth had not claimed dominance. But the demonstration had failed in the only way that mattered: in public, in front of witnesses, under the Accord's own rules. The demonstration ended without ceremony. There was no formal shutdown announcement, no declaration from the Gale Sovereign. The Dreadnought remained in emergency stabilization mode, its escorts tightening formation around the disabled vessel, as if shielding it from view could erase what had just happened. Neutral observation craft maintained their assigned positions, recording every detail of the exercise's conclusion. The Interstellar Compliance Assembly's protocols required a complete log of all events, and the data streams left nothing to interpretation. The Accord's most advanced warship had lost its primary weapons and propulsion systems during a controlled demonstration. In the hours that followed, the Assembly's verification teams began their formal review. Every sensor feed, every telemetry record was cross-referenced against the demonstration's pre-approved engagement plan. Earth's actions were methodically checked for violations. There were none. Every projectile fired by Earth's destroyers was accounted for. Every movement of registered orbital assets fell within the exercise's allowable range. The harbor's wake was logged. Exactly as scheduled, its debris redirection noted in compliance with all navigational safety protocols. The incident stood exactly as it appeared, an unexpected systems failure aboard the Gale Sovereign, unlinked to any provocation or treaty breach. The footage, however, told its own story. The moment the Dreadnought's beam arrays went dark was visible on every recorded channel. The silent drift of a ship that size, the escorts scrambling to hold formation, it was the kind of image that didn't require explanation. The assembly's observers did not speculate. They didn't need to. The visual evidence was enough. An obsolete weapons platform, operating within full treaty compliance, had coincided with the disabling of a flagship built to dominate any engagement. There was no formal accusation, but the sequence would be replayed across 100 systems. The Accord's immediate response was controlled, but unmistakable. Emergency stabilization craft moved in, locking tow lines onto the Gale Sovereign's hull. The ship was maneuvered away from its demonstration station, guided toward a holding trajectory well clear of Mars orbit. Accord officials issued their first public statement within hours. The demonstration's results were inconclusive due to unanticipated solar interference. The explanation was technically plausible. The interference cloud was a matter of record, but the phrasing was cautious, careful not to invite deeper analysis. In the assembly, Earth's delegation filed no counterstatement. Commander Rourke Venn's report was brief, stripped of anything that might be interpreted as a claim of superiority. His commentary framed the exercise as a valuable exchange of tactical doctrine, praising the Accord for its transparency. The language was bland, procedural, and entirely unprovocative. The silence was deliberate. The success of the operation lay in its understatement. No one in Earth's Defense Command wanted a confrontation over what had happened. They wanted the record to stand as it was, unchanged and unchallenged. That silence did its work. While the Accord's public channels tried to redirect attention, the incident's recording spread through unofficial networks. Military analysts across multiple systems began private reviews of the Gale Sovereign's failure. No one could openly accuse the Accord of a cover-up, not when the incident had been observed by neutral assembly craft, but no one could dismiss what they had seen either. Questions about shield harmonics, environmental interference, and unaccounted vulnerabilities began to appear in closed war college forums. In more than one system, the incident triggered quiet revisions of operational doctrine. The casual assumption that Earth's weapons posed no real threat to modern Accord shielding was no longer secure. The vulnerability of a flagship under controlled conditions forced strategic planners to consider scenarios they had previously ignored. The doctrine changes were never publicized. They were logged under classified threat assessments with a single, unremarkable label: Case Earth. On Earth, there were no celebrations. The footage played on independent news channels, but there was no official statement of victory. The Gale Sovereign had not been destroyed, and Earth had not fought a battle. There was no triumph to claim, only a demonstration that had ended in a way no one in the Accord had intended. Rourke allowed the media cycle to move on, knowing the long-term effect was more important than the immediate reaction. In the days that followed, the Gale Sovereign was escorted out of Sol space under heavy tow, its damage sealed under classified maintenance reports. The official narrative remained unchanged, a systems fault compounded by solar interference. But the reality was understood by anyone who mattered. The most advanced warship in the Accord had been disabled in open view, and Earth had not lifted a finger in violation of treaty terms. Rourke knew there was no need to argue the point. The quiet confidence of the operation was its own message. No fleet would bring a Dreadnought into Sol space again, expecting an easy show of dominance. The next time the Accord considered a demonstration, they would have to account for the possibility that another primitive weapon might erase their advantage. The deterrent was not in destruction, it was in uncertainty. In the silence that followed the Gale Sovereign's departure, Sol returned to its normal rhythms. The orbital platforms resumed their standard positions. The maintenance drones went back to clearing debris. The harbor's wake filed its final report on the debris redirection mission, closing the operation exactly as it had begun, within the letter of every law. The Accord left with their flagship under tow. Earth was left with nothing to declare and nothing it needed to explain. The demonstration had been a success, not for the reasons anyone expected, but for the ones that mattered. The most effective deterrent Earth had ever established was now in place, written not in official declarations, but in the unspoken caution of every military planner who had watched the recording. Quiet proof, visible to anyone who cared to look, had done what no escalation could. The Accord's official statement came 2 weeks after the Gale Sovereign departed soul space. In measured language, the Council announced a temporary suspension of all compliance demonstrations, pending technical review of shield harmonic stability under high-output scenarios. It was the kind of phrasing that said nothing and admitted everything. The Gale Sovereign's failure had created a problem that could not be ignored, and the fastest way to avoid further embarrassment was to halt the program entirely. No date was given for its resumption. Inside the Accord's military branches, the suspension was received with the silence of a problem being addressed in classified channels. War colleges in 3 separate systems circulated sealed notices to senior staff. Case Earth was added as a restricted doctrine tag. It was not a battle plan, not an emergency directive, just a quiet addition to the Library of Operational Studies. The classification level meant only select officers would ever see it. Those who did read it found no accusation, no dramatic claims, only a warning. Do not underestimate systems operating under perceived technological inferiority. Review shield harmonic vulnerabilities in non-combat scenarios. On Earth, the news of the suspension barely made the front page. The media cycle had moved on. The Gale Sovereign's failure remained a talking point on smaller channels, but without official statements to fuel speculation, the story lost its public momentum. In the Assembly, Earth's representatives continued their work without reference to the incident. Commander Rourke Venn filed no further reports on the exercise. For the Accord, the demonstration was officially over. For Rourke, it was complete. In the quiet of Earth Defense Command's observation deck, Rourke stood looking at Mars' orbit. The exercise zone was empty now. The space where the Gale Sovereign had anchored nothing more than a band of drifting debris and faint gravitational echoes. The void held no trace of the flagship that had come to demonstrate Earth's weakness. The silence was the only evidence of what had happened, and to Rourke, it was enough. He measured the operation not in the damage inflicted, but in the shift it had created. There was no wreckage, no victory parade, no proclamation of strength. The success lay in the deterrent that now existed in the mind of every Accord strategist. Earth was no longer a system where a flagship could arrive without risk. The memory of what had happened to the Gale Sovereign would travel farther than any declaration could. For Rourke, that was the only outcome that mattered. The demonstration had never been about destroying the Dreadnought. That would have provoked a direct confrontation, one Earth could not afford. The goal had been to plant a doubt, a single hesitation in the planning of any future exercise, a hesitation that would make Seoul a less appealing stage for the Accord's political theater. That hesitation now existed. It would persist as long as the details of the Gale Sovereign's failure remained unchallenged, and no one in the Accord was in any hurry to examine those details too closely. In the months that followed, the Accord's compliance demonstrations resumed in other systems with other member states. But the tone had changed. No Dreadnought-class vessels were deployed into member territories for routine displays. Shield configurations were adjusted, offensive postures tested with more caution. There were no public references to Earth's role in these changes, but the shift was clear to anyone paying attention. The Accord had learned from the Gale Sovereign's exercise. In Sol, the orbital platforms returned to normal operations. The maintenance drones continued their work, moving debris along calculated vectors, clearing the lanes for civilian and defense traffic. The harbor's wake completed its assignments without incident, its logs archived like any other tug in the registry. There was no celebration, no recognition. That, too, was part of the success. The operation had been designed to leave nothing for the Accord to confront. Mars' orbit remained calm. The empty position where the Gale Sovereign had once held station stayed unoccupied, a silent reminder of the shift in perception. The void looked the same as it always had, but the unspoken reality was different now. No major power would casually bring a Dreadnought into Earth's orbit again. Rourke knew there would be no permanence in that caution. Strategic memory was short, and political ambition had a way of erasing lessons over time. But for now, the operation had bought what Earth needed most: time. Time to continue building its defenses quietly. Time to expand its capabilities under the Accord's radar. Time to prepare for the day when caution would give way to pressure again. As the observation deck lights dimmed into night cycle, Rourke remained at the viewport, watching the slow drift of Mars in the distance. There were no alarms, no flashing warnings, no sign of the tension that had filled these same orbits weeks earlier. Just the silence of a system at rest, the calm that came after a demonstration no one could fully explain. The Gale Sovereign was gone. Its presence, however, lingered in the quiet changes it had left behind, in the doctrines rewritten, in the caution of future plans, in the unspoken understanding that Sol was no longer the safe stage for an easy display. Rourke left the observation deck with no sense of victory, only the knowledge that the work had been done. The calm would hold for now. That was enough. If this story made you rethink what obsolete weapons can do, hit that subscribe button for more thrilling HEFY stories. Now we want to hear from you. If you had one chance to set up a trap for an alien dreadnought, what weakness would you exploit? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one. Thanks for watching Stellar HFY, where strategy rewrites the galaxy's rules before a shot is even fired. See you in the next story.